How do you explain a lifetime built on a grave that never held a body? I'm 75 years old, and this is the first time I'm saying this out loud. My mother's grave has been empty for 60 years, and I don't know where she really is. People assume secrets fade with time. They don't. They harden, they sink into your bones. I've carried this one since 1965, since the day I stood beside a coffin I never saw opened, listening to prayers that felt rehearsed, watching neighbors cry for a woman who may not have been there at all. I was a young man then, old enough to understand fear, too young to understand how long guilt can live inside a person. Everyone believed my mother died suddenly. Heart failure, they said. Closed casket, quick burial, no questions. That was normal back then. The 1960s were full of things people didn't ask about. Government silence, family silence, churches that buried doubt along with the dead. But even as the dirt hit the wood, something inside me knew the truth was distorted. Not false, distorted. Bent just enough to survive. My mother was an ordinary woman to the outside world. A quiet life, no scandals, no headlines. But ordinary people sometimes sit closest to extraordinary secrets. She taught me that without ever meaning to. I remember her last weeks clearly, the sudden phone calls she wouldn't explain, the way she started burning papers in the sink, page after page curling into ash. She told me some truths are safer when they disappear. After the funeral, life moved on. Mine did too. I married, I worked. I became a father, then a grandfather. And every year, without fail, I visited that grave. I cleaned the stone. I placed flowers. I apologized to the ground for something I couldn't name. Because deep down I knew the marker was a lie, and lies have weight. What haunts me isn't just that the grave is empty. It's that someone wanted it that way. Someone made sure no one ever looked too closely. And I was taught, silently and effectively, to do the same. For decades I convinced myself that not knowing where my mother was meant she was simply gone, but as death gets closer, that excuse collapses. There are reasons I waited this long. There are names I've never spoken, and there is one moment, right after the funeral, that changed everything and tied me to this secret forever. Before this story goes any further, I need to know something. If you were standing where I stood, carrying a truth that could unravel an entire family, history, would you have stayed silent too? This isn't just about my mother or an empty grave. It's about how many secrets like this still exist, buried not in the ground, but inside ordinary people who were told never to speak. If you're trying to understand how something like this could stay hidden for 60 years, leave a comment below. Even a single word tells me you're really listening. This channel exists to bring these buried truths into the light, not for shock, but because understanding them changes how we see history, family, and ourselves. If this confession already made you question what you think you know about the past, take a second to like the video and subscribe. It helps these stories reach others who feel that same pull toward forgotten truths and unanswered questions. The funeral took place on a gray morning in the spring of 1965, the kind of day where everything feels muted, as if the world itself is holding its breath. I remember the smell of wet soil and cigarette smoke mixing in the air. People spoke in whispers, not out of respect but out of habit. Back then, funerals were efficient. You showed up, you cried if you were supposed to, and you trusted the process. That trust is what allowed everything else to happen. The coffin was already sealed when it arrived. Closed casket funerals weren't unusual, especially when someone supposedly died suddenly. The funeral director said it was for dignity. That word carried weight. No one challenged it. Not the priest, not the neighbors, not even my closest relatives, and I didn't either, because challenging it would have meant asking a question I wasn't ready to hear answered. There was one detail that still gnaws at me. No one saw my mother at any point that day. Not at the viewing, not at the church, not at the cemetery. The paperwork was handled quietly. The death certificate appeared like magic. Cause of death neatly typed. No autopsy. No hospital records shared with the family. Everything moved too smoothly, like a script everyone already knew. I remember standing beside the grave as the coffin was lowered, listening to the dull thud as it settled into the earth. That sound followed me for years. Because I realized something no one else seemed to notice. The coffin was lighter than it should have been. I had helped carry enough things in my life to know the difference. I felt it in my hands, in my shoulders. At the time, I told myself grief was playing tricks on me. That's what fear does, it gives you excuses. After the burial, people gathered at our house. Coffee was poured, food appeared. Conversations drifted to safer topics. Someone laughed, then apologized for laughing. Life reasserted itself quickly, almost aggressively. And that was the moment I understood the unspoken rule. Whatever questions existed, they were not welcome here. That night, alone in my childhood bedroom, I replayed the day over and over. The sealed coffin, the rushed ceremony, the absence of any real goodbye. It felt less like a funeral and more like a performance meant to close a door permanently. I didn't know who directed it, but I knew I was now part of it. From that day on, the truth didn't disappear. It waited, and over time other small inconsistencies began to surface. Details about my mother's life that no longer lined up with the story we were told. As the years passed, the small inconsistencies stopped feeling small. They began to stack, quietly, patiently. Like pieces of a puzzle no one wanted finished. My mother had raised me with strict routines, careful words, and an unusual fear of paperwork. She hated forms, records, signatures. As a child, I thought it was shyness. As an adult, I understood it was something closer to survival. After the funeral, I tried to gather her belongings. That's when I noticed how little of her past actually existed. No childhood photos, no school records, no old letters from relatives. Even her accent shifted, depending on who she spoke to. Some days it sounded local, other days it didn't belong anywhere I could name. When I asked her about her early life while she was still alive, she always deflected with stories that never quite matched each other. Years later, when I requested a copy of her birth certificate out of simple curiosity, I was told the file had been reconstructed. That word bothered me. Reconstructed from what? Who decided what went back in? The document listed a birthplace she had never mentioned and parents she had never spoken of. It felt less like a record and more like a replacement. I began to realize my mother didn't just disappear at death. She had been disappearing her entire life, layer by layer. Names changed, addresses shifted. Even her handwriting altered over time, as if she was slowly becoming someone else. Ordinary people don't do that unless they're running from something or protecting something far bigger than themselves. The most unsettling realization came when I found a photo hidden inside a book she kept locked away. It showed her standing beside two men in dark suits, taken sometime in the late 1940s. There were no smiles, no casual posture. It looked official, controlled. On the back was a date and a city she never claimed to have visited. That was the moment I stopped asking whether she was hiding something and started asking who she was hiding it from. What terrifies me now is not that my mother lied to me. It's that the lie was consistent, supported and quietly reinforced by systems meant to preserve truth. Someone helped her disappear long before she was buried, and by living my life as her son, I became part of that illusion, without ever agreeing to it. There is a moment in every long-buried secret where innocence ends, even if you don't realize it at the time. For me, it happened when I was 23. Young enough to believe authority knew best, old enough to be held responsible for what I did next. It started with a letter that arrived without a return address. Inside was a single request written in careful, formal language, asking me to come to a government office downtown. No explanation, no threat, just a time, a date, and a reminder to bring identification. In the late 1960s, that kind of letter carried weight. You didn't ignore it. The man I met there never gave his full name. He spoke calmly, politely, like someone used to being obeyed without raising his voice. He said, "My mother's death." Records had minor inconsistencies, and that correcting them was a routine matter. All I needed to do was confirm a few details and sign where he indicated. I remember hesitating. I remember feeling that familiar tightening in my chest, the same one I'd felt at the graveside years earlier. He noticed. He leaned forward and said something that still echoes in my head. Some things stay buried because digging only hurts the people still alive. It sounded compassionate, reasonable. I signed. That signature did more than adjust paperwork. It sealed a version of history that wasn't true. By agreeing to it, I ensured no one would ever question why hospital records were missing, why timelines didn't align, why her body was never verified. I told myself I was protecting my family. In reality, I was protecting a system that needed my mother erased cleanly. After that, the questions stopped. Official silence replaced confusion. And with that silence came fear. Fear of what would happen if I spoke. Fear of what I had already helped hide. Fear that my mother's disappearance wasn't an accident, but a controlled outcome with consequences that stretched far beyond our family. I didn't understand the full weight of my choice until decades later, when I realized something unbearable. Even if I wanted to uncover the truth now, my own actions had helped lock it away. I didn't learn my mother's real name until I was already in my late 60s, and even then, it came to me by accident. I was cleaning out an old storage unit I'd been paying for without remembering why, a place filled with objects I'd been too afraid to throw away. At the bottom of a rusted metal box, beneath outdated passports and brittle newspaper clippings, I found a document that didn't match any version of her identity I knew. The name on it wasn't unfamiliar, but it wasn't hers either. It belonged to a woman who officially died in Europe in the late 1940s, according to the attached report. Same birth year, same physical description, same scar on the left wrist my mother always covered with a watch. What chilled me wasn't the resemblance. It was the implication that my mother had stepped into a life that already had an ending. As I dug deeper, I found traces of an erased past that lined up with historical events I'd only ever seen in documentaries. Displaced persons camps, post-war intelligence operations, quiet relocations handled through church networks and government intermediaries. Ordinary people. Think history is shaped by presidents and generals. It isn't. It's shaped by nameless individuals who are moved, renamed, and silenced to keep larger truths intact. My mother wasn't a criminal in the way people imagine. She wasn't hiding stolen money or running from justice. She was hiding knowledge about people who disappeared, about exchanges that never made it into public records, about how identities were traded like currency during unstable times, the kind of knowledge that makes witnesses more dangerous than perpetrators. Suddenly her fear made sense. The burned papers, the shifting accents, the refusal to anchor herself to a single story. She wasn't reinventing herself for freedom. She was surviving under terms imposed on her long before I was born. What terrifies me now is realizing that the empty grave wasn't meant to protect her. It was meant to erase her completely, leaving no physical proof that she ever existed under any name. And by living quietly, raising a family and dying on paper decades earlier than her body ever did, she became the perfect solution to a problem history didn't want remembered. Living with a secret like this doesn't feel dramatic day to day. It feels quiet, ordinary. That's the most dangerous part. You wake up, go to work, raise children, attend birthdays and funerals, all while carrying the constant awareness that one wrong question could collapse everything. For 60 years, I measured my words carefully, avoided certain topics, and learned how to look calm when names, places, or years came up that were too close to the truth. The fear wasn't of punishment, it was of exposure, of someone noticing the pattern I spent decades pretending didn't exist. I avoided journalists. I stayed away from genealogy research when it became popular. When DNA testing kits started showing up in commercials, I felt my chest tighten in a way no doctor could explain. Technology was doing what time hadn't managed to do yet. Peeling back layers meant to stay sealed. There were moments I almost broke. Late at night watching documentaries about post-war disappearances, intelligence operations, people who vanished without records. I'd recognize details, procedures, language. It felt like watching my own life explained without my name attached to it. And every time I'd turn it off before the credits rolled, afraid that staying until the end might mean admitting something to myself I wasn't ready to face. The grave became my anchor. As long as it existed, as long as there was a physical place people could point to and say, "She's there," the illusion held. But each visit felt heavier. I wasn't mourning my mother anymore. I was guarding a lie. And lies rot from the inside, even when they're carefully maintained. What haunts me most is realizing how many people helped keep this secret alive without ever speaking about it. Clergy, officials, paper pushers who understood the value of silence. They aged. They died. And with each passing year, the number of people who knew the full truth shrank until it rested almost entirely with me. Now, at 75, the fear has shifted. It's no longer about being discovered. It's about what happens if the truth dies with me. Because if it does, then my mother truly disappears forever, not just from records, but from reality itself. I didn't decide to speak because I suddenly became brave. I decided because my body started giving me deadlines my mind could no longer ignore. Doctors use careful language when they're running out of options. They talk about time frames and quality of life. I heard something else underneath it all. Whatever you're holding, you won't be able to hold it much longer. For years I believed silence was a form of protection, that keeping my mother's secret intact was a way of honoring whatever sacrifice she was forced to make. But as I grew older, that belief began to fracture. Protection turns into erasure when no one remembers the truth. And guilt doesn't fade with age. It sharpens. It becomes specific. What finally pushed me here was something small and almost ridiculous. A letter from a local cemetery office informing me that the plot lease would need renewal. 60 years later, they were still maintaining a grave that had never served its purpose. I stood there holding that letter and realized how absurd it all was. An empty space consuming time, money, and belief, while the real story remained, scattered, undocumented, unfinished. I don't know where my mother truly ended up. I have theories, places tied to relocations that never made the news, facilities that existed briefly, then vanished from maps. There are records that don't align, coordinates that repeat across unrelated cases, patterns that suggest she wasn't the only one moved, renamed, and erased. If her body rests somewhere else, it isn't alone. It's part of something much larger than our family ever understood. What frightens me most is that there may still be physical proof somewhere. A second burial, an unmarked grave, a record hidden where no one thought to look because they trusted the official version too much. Truth has a way of surviving in fragments, waiting for the right moment to resurface. That's why I'm telling this now. Not to accuse, not to resolve everything, but to interrupt the silence before it becomes permanent. Because once I'm gone, there will be no one left to connect these pieces. And whatever is still buried may remain that way forever. If you're still here, thank you. Staying until the end means you didn't just hear a story, you carried it with me. Stories like this survive only when someone else chooses to remember them. If this confession made you question how many truths are still buried by time, secrecy, or fear, subscribe to the channel. This is where final confessions surface, where ordinary lives intersect with extraordinary secrets history tried to erase. Leave a like if you believe these stories deserve to be heard, not forgotten. And if you made it all the way to the end, I want you to comment, "I remember." That tells me you were here, that this truth didn't disappear again. When you're ready, watch the next video appearing on your screen. There are more secrets waiting, and some of them are even closer to home.